As we poll our clients around the world, we're seeing that that number's tracking to anything between 30 and 50% of their time is being spent working with people who don't actually need to listen to them. And so it's important, I think, to distinguish between authority, influence, and manipulation, and also to see as leaders how we can create engagement across a broad range of stakeholders. And one of the ways that we do that is by understanding how we can develop our own influencing style in terms of influencing currencies. So what I've done is I've put together a very short roadmap. We'll look at what is influencing first, and then from there we'll go through an analysis of the leadership continuum. We'll talk about these currencies and really get you to give me your thoughts about application on this topic. So I think the first question we want to ask is, what is influencing? And influencing certainly is a topic that is front and center when you think about leadership. Where we get stuck is we've often tied leadership and influence purely to position. We've understood that it's only when you've got the corner office or you've got the title or you've got the seniority that you're going to in fact be successful. And I want to suggest to you that as leaders, wherever you are in the world, that ability to separate position from influence is very, very important. But then the question, of course, is what is influence? And whilst there are hundreds of definitions out there and many different perspectives on influence, I would like to suggest to you that influencing at its very core involves both the art and the science of using sources of power and persuasion. And I think we get stuck the moment we see the word power, because traditionally power gets a bad rap. We think about it in quite negative connotations. In my purpose here, I'm simply using power to refer to how we get things done, how we get a particular result. And actually power then is nothing more than your capacity, your ability to cause an effect in a direct or an indirect or a tangible or an intangible way. So when we think about that, it might be helpful for us just to lay a couple of foundations, because leaders will often say to me, well, Andy, you know, when I reach a certain level in the organization, then I really believe that I will have the power to shift things. And if I leave you with one message today, it would be to understand that as leaders, we really need to recognize that influence and authority are two different sources of power. And if you're only going to rely on position, on hierarchy, on command and control, that reinforces much of the stereotype leadership that we've seen from yesteryear. The charismatic leader, the heroic leader, the all-knowing guru who occupies this position simply because of their length of experience or their expertise. What we're seeing more and more radically, particularly as organizations have become more matrixed and more hybrid, is that need to be able to influence without authority is paramount. That you will be called to work with people and alongside people who have a different performance agreement to you, but whose help you often need to be able to achieve what you need to achieve. And I think the other thing that's important is to recognize that in often cases in a matrix or in a hybrid environment, they may well have contradictory objectives on their performance agreement. And so this give and take and to and fro in terms of influence becomes absolutely critical. So when I think about influence versus authority, I think what's important to understand is, where are you drawing your power from to get things done? And if your view of power is limited purely to a traditional view of leadership, then I would argue that you may well be missing out on opportunities to move the organization, to move people, and to become far more collaborative in the way that you work. And that's a big issue when it comes to leadership, and it's certainly something that I covered when I launched my book in 2021. So having given us a little bit of insight into what we mean by influencing, let me talk briefly about this leadership continuum. this is an abstract idea, but I think it has a lot of mileage. And what I want to suggest to you is that if you think about a line, let's go from left to right here on this slide. On the left-hand side would be that traditional leadership. I'm going to call it command and control because many of us would relate to that kind of description. Top-down, push style of leadership. I withhold reward or I execute punishment. My power tied very much to my title and my position. As we move along that leadership continuum, we come to influence. And I made the comment in my book that the most significant forms of power are often independent of position. And I think that's a very important concept for us to understand. That if we're only going to tie our power to position, we get stuck if we don't have that position. But what we're seeing in these virtual workplaces, in these remote workplaces, in places where people are becoming much more hybrid, is that the position is less important than the ability to use influencing currencies in an ethical way to achieve the objective, whether that's at a personal level or a team level or a business unit level. The challenge, of course, is when neither of those work, then we resort to this thing called manipulation. And the problem with manipulation is it doesn't have a label on the tin that says to you, you are now being manipulated. It's only after the fact that you say, that was Andy's agenda. It's often covert, it's often deceptive, it's typically one-sided. It's always going to be to the benefit of the person doing the manipulating and at the disadvantage of the person who is manipulated. And what I see in organizations a lot is when they don't get what they want through command and control, they'll try some ethical influencing and then resort to the good old manipulation tactics. Here's the problem. From a reputational capital point of view, the moment you do that, whether we're talking about NGOs or corporates or faith-based organizations, the moment you resort to manipulation and the people you have manipulated see that, the currency of trust, the currency of credibility is gone, and it's very, very difficult to come back from that. What I want you to think about then in terms of influencing is that it's not so much what is the difference between influencing and manipulation, but rather when does influence become manipulation? And so there's quite a lot going on this slide, but I think it helps us just to lay out this idea that influence is a skill. It's guiding others towards decisions and actions. It's done in the open, there's transparency, there's respect, and it's going to give people many more choices. So there's a sense of amorality in the influencing we're talking about here. But manipulation is going to be one-sided. I'm not going to be clear about my intentions. I'm going to use trickery or deceit or misinformation. Or I'm going to put you under stress to make a decision, while stocks last, if you like. Or place you in some kind of discomfort in order to achieve that desired goal. Now, as I share those examples with you, I'm sure that as a leader, you can think of instances where you've seen people get things done through command and control, and it works. It works well in a crisis. It works particularly well where you need compliance. It works particularly well in an emergency. You've probably also seen leaders that rely on other sources of power, and we'll talk about these currencies later, where people feel buy-in, they feel a desire to be engaged, they want to work with the leader because there's that sense of quid pro quo. And you've probably also seen instances where in failing to achieve anything via the other two approaches, somewhere on that continuum, you possibly have been the victim of some form of manipulation. And I think there are many organizations who are challenged by the need to create psychological safety because there is this lack of trust, because the only way they know to get things done is through this covert approach. And so what we're talking about today is not just influencing without authority, but ethical influencing without authority and what they would look like in terms of think lead. I want to keep this light in terms of theory, But I do think it may be helpful for me to just show you one framework which was put together by Cohen and Bradford, gosh, probably 16, 17 years ago. And what they said was essentially the first thing you want to do when you're looking to influence is you want to assume positive intent. So if I'm looking to influence Adrian or Dave or Raynor, I'm assuming that we are potential allies. I'm not coming from the basis of what is the agenda and we're not second guessing each other. Then it's really important that we have some alignment around goals. I think particularly in matrix and in hybrid, because there are so many competing voices, it becomes particularly difficult to often get that crystal clear focus on what it is that you're trying to achieve and with those multiple priorities, which comes first. Particularly as I work with companies that have a global reach with a local presence, that challenge of juggling the global with the local can be a real problem. This diagnosing the world of the other, we've seen leadership people talk about this in very different guises. Walking the extra mile, putting yourself in the shoes of the other party, trying to understand where they're coming from. And I think when you come to me with a request, or you're trying to convince me or something, or you're trying to sell me something, being able to understand context of what I'm busy with and what my priorities are is a fundamental approach of respect and courtesy, particularly when it comes to influencing. I see too many people who act irrespective of context, who are not really taking the time to understand what I'm doing at the moment and what I'm busy with, and then thrusting into my world with an email or an urgent phone call and expecting me to drop everything without understanding what I'm busy with and how this could be an opportunity to collaborate. You'll see that the model talks about currencies, and I'm going to play with this a little bit today because just as when I travel from South Africa to, gosh, the US or Europe or to the Middle East, I have to go to an exchange. I have to take my local South African rands and convert them into a currency in the local market. The same idea with influencing. We all have currencies. We may not necessarily be aware of what those are, but once you identify them, the second question is, well, what are the currencies that the other party needs? And I'd like us to have some time today looking at these different currencies, showing you how the currencies are moving and whether we are keeping up with that in terms of our influencing approach. It's all about relationships, and ultimately it's about this give and take, this reciprocity. So this is a well-respected approach to thinking about influence, and I wanted to put this in there because we could spend the whole time today just looking at this framework and identifying, are we working with allies? Are we clear about our goals? Do we really understand where the other person is coming from? Have we identified not just our currencies, but theirs? Are we building relationship, or is this just for the sake of getting something done? And are we serious about this quid pro quo of recognizing that very often influence will involve some degree of reciprocity? So having looked at the model, I think what's really important is to then ask ourselves, okay, so what does this mean from an influencing point of view? And I think what it means is that we need to recognize that social capital becomes absolutely critical. Now, what do I mean by social capital? I'm not just talking about how many friends you have on Facebook. I'm not just talking about what you're doing in terms of social media. I'm talking about the fact that in the new world of work, it is true to say that it's not just what you know, but who you know. And I think that's why the think lead philosophy and the tools that are available are so powerful, because it gives you access to other like-minded people, enables you to grow your network, and enables you to see what is going on from an influencing perspective, and developing your social capital in terms of that network is important. So one of the things that I get my clients to do is to develop, and it's called different things, a networking map, a stakeholder map, something that would visually represent, whether it's in concentric circles or blocks, proximity. So how close are you to these people, not just geographically, but relationally? the strength of the influence. So what is the strength of the relationship? What's the frequency of the interaction? What's the strength of the relationship, not just between you and these stakeholders, but between the stakeholders themselves? And also, I think very importantly, are there opportunities within this stakeholder map to identify leverage points, people who may be mavens or gatekeepers who can then give you access into other networks? We've seen, using a stakeholder map or network map approach, that often the greatest opportunities for influence lie at the weakest links. Sometimes I'm asked, well, Andy, what format should this be in? And I don't think it really matters. You know, I've got people who use flip chart paper, I've got people who do it on PowerPoint, I've got people who do it on an A4 piece of paper, I've got some colleagues who do post-it notes. The thing about the relationship map or the network map is you want to start to just ring fence who is in your ecosystem, and secondly, where do they lie in terms of influence, access, information, resource, and who's coming in and who's coming out. And if you can graphically demonstrate that in a way that enables you to answer these 4 questions, who is likely to benefit from this? This could be a project, it could be an opportunity. Whose agenda might this clash with? Who do I know already who could help me? And who do I need to form a relationship with? Now you're starting to be more strategic about not just building relationship, but understanding that stakeholder management is a critical part of influencing without authority. And I think it's a shame that as leaders, that often it's only when we need something, or we're trying to launch something, or we're trying to sell something, that we go on this roadshow campaign to try and build our network. When all of the leaders I know who are effective are consciously putting in time into building relationships, not to sell something, but to add value and to see how they can enhance and encourage and support. And again, that's why I think something like the Think Lead app is a beautiful platform to help you to start to see how that ecosystem could work. When I get people to submit their stakeholder maps, they come in various guises, as I said. Here's one example. I've taken out the names, but you can see that what this individual has done is they've identified certain positions. The size of the circles could be important. That would give you some sense of the influence that person has or they have on that person. You'll also see that there are different thicknesses in terms of the lines, and that could indicate something of the strength of the relationship or the frequency of interaction. So how you slice and dice this, I don't think matters. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a sense from an influencing perspective of who are my stakeholders, where do the significant pockets of influence lie, what's the strength of the relationship, what's the frequency of interaction, and am I leveraging this relationship in a way that enables me to achieve what I need to achieve in terms of my objectives, but at the same time gives this other party the opportunity to do the same. And so I don't believe you can influence without authority unless you are very intentional about networking. Why is that important? It gives you access quickly to people when you need it. It helps you to build your understanding of people's priorities, of their perspectives and of their personalities, but it also enhances your personal power. And one of the things we'll talk about later on in today's presentation is how I think the currencies are shifting, not just from head knowledge and expertise and length of service, but more so to who do you have in your network and in your ecosystem that will enable you to get things done. I remember many years ago there was that classic movie by Kevin Bacon called 6 Degrees of Separation. This idea that we all knew somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody that may be, I don't know, of significance or celebrity. And when you unpack that, you start to realize, particularly in the digital age, how relationships are so crucial, and how in this new world of work, you know, I'm a Zoom call away, I'm a Teams meeting away from being able to get access to a range of people around the world. So I think what's important at this stage is to then say, okay, if I know something about what influencing is, and if I know something about this leadership continuum, and if I know something about the difference between command and control and ethical influencing and manipulation, and if I know something about the importance of social capital, then the question that needs to be asked is, how do I leverage these influencing currencies? What are they? How do they work? And how are they shifting in this new world of work? Well, I think to answer that, let me go to the Center for Creative Leadership. And they start by saying influence can happen at its most simple level at 3 levels. It can happen at the level of rationality. So today, part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to appeal to your logic with well-researched, well-articulated position. But I'm also trying to make an emotional appeal. I'm trying to connect my message to a goal, to a project, to your individual values. But I'm also saying to you, if you want to influence, it's going to be important that you really are raising the level of collaboration and consultation and alliance. We could stop at this point, and I could ask you just to consider how effective are you on these 3 levels. Influencing at the level of rationality, influencing at the level of emotion, and influencing at the level of cooperation. These are not new ideas. You know, we think back to Aristotle, and the notions of ethos and pathos and logos still stand true. But I think if we develop this influencing idea, we can start to recognize that there are different persuasion principles. I think here of the work of Professor Robert Cialdini, who spoke about the fact that when we persuade people, we might use reciprocity, if you, I will. We might use commitment. We might use social proof, the fact that many other people are doing it. We might still appeal to authority. We might influence because we like each other. There's a sense of affiliation. We might influence because of scarcity. We try and manipulate that supply and demand, or not even manipulate. It is just a fact. But I think the reality is, as leaders, we have to start to understand that the choices we make in our leadership are tied to the choices we make in terms of how we influence. And I'm going to give you 2 metaphors here. The one metaphor is of a toolbox, and the other metaphor that I'm going to give you is of the currencies. The toolbox, I think, works well because it says, okay, if I want to influence somebody, I might use content. So this would be facts and data, much like the rationality we saw earlier. But then I've worked with leaders, coaching them on their executive presence, and I've got 2 C-suite members, both with the same data, and one is far more convincing than the other. And that's not so much about the evidence that they present, but it's how they package it. It's how they come across. It's how they're able to appeal to their audience. It's how they're able to inspire. It may be that your influencing is based on attractiveness. Here we're not talking about beauty, although that can often help, but we're thinking about the way you consult, the way you demonstrate reciprocity. It could also be about the context and the relationships that you have. So toolbox, the idea is that, as Maslow said, if everything, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything becomes a nail. The idea here is that you have a range of influencing strategies that you're using to improve the quality of your message. The second metaphor, which I think is maybe even more helpful, saying the same thing, is this notion of currencies. And what I want you to see here is that we probably have more influencing opportunities than we realize. So I have resources that I can offer you. I could go to coercion. That's the old style command and control. I could withhold or provide reward. I could rely on my position. But down the right-hand side, I want you to see that there are some other currencies. There's your network, there's your personality, your disposition, there's the access to information that you have, there's your expertise. And what's interesting for me about this slide is it forces me to say, where am I going to for my influencing? What sources of power and persuasion am I relying on? And secondly, are these actually the currencies that my stakeholders need? Now, if I was to show you exactly the same list again, what I want you to see this time is I'm going to group them into 4 categories. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that based on the work of Dent and Brent, and this comes from their book Influencing Skills and Techniques, and also the work of Goleman, Boyatzis and McKee in Primal Leadership, that we can probably start to put influencing styles into 4 categories. 2 of those I'm going to call push styles. Think top-down, think more traditional, still required. And 2 of them I'm going to call pull strategies. And you might want to think about a magnet here. So pushing or repelling versus attracting. I'm not suggesting that we should use one over the other. What I am suggesting is that the most effective influencers are aware of moving across all 4 blocks as required. So if I take that same list that I showed you here and I put them into a 4-block category, we end up with something that looks like this. Now this for me is interesting because what you'll see in the top left-hand corner is the more traditional approach to leadership. I'm in authority, I have the resources, I share those or I withhold reward. We're calling that a push style of influence. It still has a place. The point I made in my introduction is that for most of us, that's not going to be our go-to style because in many cases, the people we're influencing, we have little or no authority over. In the bottom left is a very interesting group of influencing currencies. And for many of us, it's where we've become comfortable. Expertise, research, postgraduate work, information, length of service, my ability to go and find data and then bring that back and formulate a convincing argument. But why is it seen as a push style of persuasion? Because it's still very much top down. It's less collaborative. It's still you being the one that has the answers and people being, much more passive recipients. I think we are seeing in this evolving post-pandemic world, particularly as people navigate hybrid, that influencing without authority is going to require more collaborating. Going back to what we said about social network, who's in your network, who's in your alliances, who are you in a relationship with, who's in your ecosystem, in order to help you to get things done. And then in the bottom right there, fascinating that these are people who are very clear that the future is not one, but many. And that there may not just be a possible future, but that there is a probable future and that there is a preferred future. And that what I do with visioning is I use my imagination, I use my positivity to influence you to say, I'm acknowledging the status quo. I can see that we're in trouble here. And if we carry on this trajectory, we're going to end up in a real mess. However, come with me and dream the dream of what is possible if we step up to the plate in terms of leadership. I'm going to leave this one up for a moment. And I'm going to ask you just to think about your own leadership style and your own leadership and influencing approach. And the question I want to ask you is simple. Which of these currencies are you using? Which of these currencies do you feel you've got expertise in? And which of these currencies do you think your stakeholders may well benefit from if you were to start using them more? Those are important questions. And I would have loved to have had an opportunity to interview all of you as we think about this and as we start to consider the impact of these influencing currencies on the way that we work. So with that background, I think what's important at this stage is to start to tie things together and to recognize that ultimately as leaders, we need to build our personal power and do that by considering the extent of our influencing capabilities. And so I have 2 questions for you. What actions could you take to extend your sphere of influence outside of formal authority? And the second question is, if you start to think about how you currently build and maintain those resources, what actions could you take to further develop your personal power, and where could you find the support that is needed. I think, Dave, as I close this part before we take questions, what's really important is for people to recognize that there is an opportunity now to consider what are the next steps. So what am I going to do differently as a leader that will make me more influential, that will make me more aware of the currencies I have at my disposal? It may be that I need to do a stakeholder map. It may be that I need to be much more aware of that leadership continuum from command and control to ethical influencing, and how we often fall into that trap of manipulation. It may be that I need to be much more aware of the currencies that I'm using, and recognizing that in many cases I'm trying to use a one-size-fits-all approach, which doesn't necessarily suit the objective or the set of stakeholders that I'm trying to influence. And so, Dave, I think with that, let me hand back to you and see if there are any questions. But thank you for this opportunity just to share some high-level thoughts from a journey of leadership of more than 30 years, and challenging people to think about how influencing is at the core of what we do in order to become better leaders. Thanks so much, Dave.
Andy, thank you very much. I found that extremely interesting, as I'm sure everybody in the presentation did. That dichotomy between influencing and authority always a topic of great interest to people and to leaders, and hopefully we've learned a lot from it, and how we can use our personal power to influence more than using our authority of office, etc. So are there any questions that anybody would like to ask Andy? And so please just unmute and go ahead and ask Andy. Thank you.
And if it's okay, I'd like to go first. I really enjoyed your presentation, just the different aspects of influencing that you can have as a leader. I found it quite fascinating, so thank you for that, and how you can go about influencing others. But I think you mentioned right at the beginning of your presentation that a lot of people associate leadership with obviously their positions, and they feel that they need to influence from their position of authority and that sort of thing. And a lot of people feel that they cannot be leaders until they've reached that sort of position of leadership, you know. And I think that's a perception and a mindset that a lot of people have. And what would you say to people that have that perception? How would they, because obviously how would they go about trying to change that and to change that mindset? Maybe there's a lack of self-belief there. I don't know, what advice would you give to someone with that type of perception or mindset?
It's a great question, Reno, and I think there's two parts. The first is context. So for those of us who live in South Africa, the models that we've been given tend to be exactly that, is that leadership is tied to position, to hierarchy, to much more of in many cases, a patriarchal system. So that's the first thing, is people often don't get it because what they're seeing is exactly that. And to show them that there are other ways of influencing outside of formal authority, it starts with the mindset. I think the second thing then is to do this currency audit and say, yes, we acknowledge that there has to be people in authority. We've got no problem with formal leadership in terms of that role. But for the majority of us, we're never going to get the corner office. We're never going to be the CEO or the MD or the board member. And does that mean that they're only then the people who get to lead? Or do I have within my own ability leadership skills which are about moving people towards a particular goal and executing? You know, for me, Reno, at the simplest level, effective leadership is about execution of task, execution of strategy, moving people towards a goal on the one hand, and being highly emotionally intelligent and recognizing the need to take people with you at the same time. Neither of those have to be tied to a position. And when people see that and they're liberated from this belief, as you say, that I can only get things done when I have the title, I think organizations can change. The level of accountability goes up. People start taking responsibility for their own environment. They start controlling what is in their control. And that's why for me this topic is so important. But in many ways, Reno, I think where you started, it starts with mindset. But the problem, particularly in our local South African context, is the message we're given, often unconsciously, is that the only leadership that really counts is when you have the formal position. And we've got to work hard at Think Lead to help people to break that paradigm.
Thanks, Andy. Great. Appreciate that.
Andy,
Adrian, how are you, my friend?
I'm okay. I don't want to hijack this brilliant presentation that you just gave, but how do you understand an Elon Musk through these models? Or is he too exceptional for this? So you know, it's understandable to see when you're a corporate professional leader, you know, to apply a lot of these models. Then you get these exceptional people like an Elon Musk, who obviously has done something right by becoming the wealthiest man in the world, not by appointing professional leaders, but himself taking Tesla and SpaceX and several other organizations to the highest in their field. And then he comes along and he buys a very visible, powerful organization like Twitter. And one could argue, well, he's had to go to the command control side of things because it's been bleeding for a long time. Yet when people do a poll on him, like now, then only, I think 46% people say he's a poor leader and about 25% say he's an excellent leader. So I'm just trying to, if you were sitting with him, could he have done, I know it's from a distance, I know that, but could he have done it differently? Could he have brought more emotion into it? Is he doing it the right way? Is he influenced by the culture of America, where, by the way, I think they seem to have a very autocratic type style. You're allowed to hire and fire. The strong man becomes the president, you know, as opposed to the very collaborative person. Yeah, how do you understand a man like him, who is clearly very genius and brilliant, and people say he's a bad leader, he's a poor leader. That's what polls say. Our own polls say that. But is he really?
So, Adrian, I've never met Elon, and so it would be unfair for me to comment on him as a human being, because everything I'm going to tell you is secondhand. So that's the first thing. What I can comment on is exactly some of the things that you've mentioned. And I think, you know, the problem with much of what we do in leadership, and particularly when I work with my postgraduate students, is we want to take the exception and then say, well, that nullifies everything we've ever learned about leadership. So the moment you talk about an ethical leader, you know, well, then what about, you know, global political leaders? The moment you talk about somebody who leads with psychological safety or compassion, well, then what about, you know, innovators and so on? So I think that's the second point. I do think, Adrian, just on the Twitter thing, you know, he came in with a very clear agenda to sweep clean. But by his own admission, you know, 2 days, not even 2 days later, he was rehiring some of the people that that he'd let go of. Your question to me is, what would you be saying to Elon? I would never presume to tell Elon anything. You know, he's been far more successful than I could ever hope to be. But from a leadership perspective, I would want us to have a conversation around how do we continue to breathe life into this incredible, clearly incredible vision that this man has, not just for the planet, but for, you know, the planets beyond. But how do we bring people along, and how do we make sure that there is that care, there is that concern, there is that well-being for the people that make the vision reality? And certainly, if I look at the PR, Adrian, which is all I can go by, I think there's work to be done in how he does that, which could be informing something of why the polls that you're reading are what they are. I'm not trying to hedge my bets here, Adrian. It's just I don't know the man. I've never had a conversation with him, and I don't want to speak from hearsay. But based on the actions themselves, just based on Twitter and on people who've worked with him and who report on that, I think there is a real opportunity to develop the emotional intelligence, the concern, and the insight for people. Clearly, he has gifting on the strategy side, and if he could combine those, who knows what possibilities there could be. That would be my answer, Adrian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andy.
Great, thanks, Adrian. Thanks, good question. And Reynold, any other questions or comments from anybody for Andy?
I just see Linda's commenting, Dave, in chat about the stakeholder map.
Yeah.
You know, and again, just to underline that, Linda, there's 25 different ways you can do that, but just getting a handle on who's in the ecosystem, I think, is so critical.
Great. And then, of course, Colin has also said that he hasn't got any questions, but he this session. Thanks, Colin. And thanks to everybody. Any other questions?
Sorry, can I jump in?
Of course you can. Go ahead.
Andy, so I think it's a bit of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I work with a number of participants in my course, and they often ask me if they have a leader, we're talking academic and in the private practice, if they have a leader who's fairly autocratic. And obviously this leadership style does not appeal and it excludes versus includes. How do they address that? How do they bring out? So I know it's a difficult one.
No, it's a great question, Linda, and it's a fundamental question. And part of influencing, which we didn't talk about today, is influencing upwards. So particularly when you have that leader that's occupying the corner office and is reasoning from command and control, where does that leave you? And I think in short, Linda, you've got to become much more strategic in recognizing that that kind of leader wants results. They don't have a lot of time for chit chat. They don't really suffer fools easily. And so part of your way to get them on side is to go into task mode, is to go into execution mode, is to make sure you go in well prepared. This is not to feed ego, but it's just to understand that that's the way that they work. However, I also think that in the new collaborative leadership model, we're going to see people becoming much more bold in speaking up and speaking out and challenging authority where they have the data and the perspective and the insight. And I also see we're seeing a generation of leaders that really couldn't, I don't want to say they don't care, but they're not as enamored by title or by position as, say, my generation or my parents' generation. And I think leaders will be shown up in their inefficiencies if they're going to rely purely on that hierarchical approach. But to your point, Linda, the skill now that we're talking about is not just lateral or vertical down, it's also vertical up. And that requires a very intensive focus on what currencies does that leader require of me? How do I make sure that I'm not selling myself short? And how do I make sure that I'm not reinforcing the very dynamic that this leader is feeding off, but still showing respect, still getting the job done, but realizing that it's going to be up to me to influence upwards to challenge the status quo. And I think that's a critical part of what you're asking.
Yeah, and the difficult part to do, I suppose.
It is.
Thank you.
Great question, Linda. Thank you very much. Anybody who would like to ask Andy before we hand over a little bit of time to Raynor? Any questions or comments for Andy? I'd just like to thank you on behalf of Think Lead for an incredible presentation, really very informative, presented and very well put across. And thank you so much, Andy, for your time, for your knowledge, for your kindness, your inspiration. I know that you've pretty much gotten out of a sick bed to present to us today, and you've done an incredible job, and really appreciate the way you serve people and help people. Just to also mention Andy's book, Leadership, The Exponential Effect. A very powerful book that Andy's written, available from Andy and from bookstores around South Africa and on Amazon, etc. So please go ahead and purchase that book and enjoy Andy's knowledge and expertise. He is really has so much knowledge. I've had the very fortunate experience of spending with Andy as we just up the drag from each other or down the drag from each other, whichever way you look at it. But Andy, it's been a pleasure having you as our guest today, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks to you, and Raynor and Adrian. Go well.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So I'm just going to hand a little bit of time over to Raynor now. So Raynor, it's over to you, please.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Dave. Thank you again, Andy. Yeah, we really, really appreciated that. For those of you that obviously were participating in this, Andy shared a bit about our ThinkLead app, and that's the ThinkLead ecosystem. I'm just going to share a little bit about that with you all, because it's very, very important. A lot of the things that Andy was speaking about with regards to leadership and so on, and developing yourself as a leader, these sorts of things just can't happen just off the cuff or once off. You know, you can't just go and attend one workshop or one course and think that you're a leader now, that you've arrived, or that you've achieved a certain position and now all of a sudden you're a leader. That's not how it works. There's a lot more to leadership. And so we've created the ThinkLead ecosystem to help us to continuously develop ourselves as leaders, because that's how we actually become better, and that's how we grow ourselves as leaders. Just like any other profession is required to continuously develop themselves. You look at the HR profession, the medical professions, lawyers, accountants, and so on. They all have to be part of some sort of professional body or organization in order to prove that they are continuously developing themselves. And we are saying that the overarching profession of all of these is leadership. It's the most critical of all these professions, but yet no one has sort of gone on and tried to advocate for the professionalizing of leadership, which is what we are doing. So we've created this ecosystem to help us to do that. Just to let you know what this does for you as a leader being part of this ecosystem. Well, first of all, you'll be able to participate in what we call leadership fitness activities inside the ecosystem, or even if you're participating in things that are developing you as a leader outside, you'll be able to record all those activities inside the ecosystem. This is just to show or to give you these actions and these things that you need to be doing in order to develop yourself as a leader. So as you could say, we've given this analogy of leadership fitness. That's when you look at yourself, want to become physically fit, normally you'd either join a gym or you'll engage in some sort of exercise program, and you'll need the sort of workouts, the exercises, the reps, the sets, or a sort of program that you need to follow in order to develop your fitness. So it's the same sort of premise on developing yourself as a leader. So we have this ecosystem records all those actions, all those things that you are doing to develop yourself as a leader and to make yourself more leadership fit. Within the ecosystem, you'll be able to earn points. So just as you would for the other professional bodies and organizations, you have to earn points to show that you are competent within that specific profession. You have to do the same here on the ecosystem. So you'll earn points for all these activities that you've completed. With those points, you'll be able to climb up the fitness leadership ladder, the different levels of fitness leadership, level 1 to 6, which I'll show you in a moment as well. I'll give you a nice diagram of it so you can see it. So you'll be able to show just how you are progressing up these different levels, dependent on how many points you have earned so far in the ecosystem. You'll be able to achieve as well a place on the global leaderboard inside the system. So people can come onto the system, take a look at the global leaderboard, which is ranked you as from those with the most points down to the least points. And they can rank you and filter you through your industry, through your current leadership level that you have within your organization, through your country, and just all these different ways so that people can come on and see just how you are developing as a leader. So this, in a way, is for you to share that your leadership brand with the rest of the world as well. You'll be able to be rewarded, hopefully, with more leadership responsibilities, either as a consultant or within your own organization, or maybe you'll get headhunted somewhere else. You know, there's a lot of opportunities that can come about because of this. And finally, as well, you'll be able to present a portfolio of evidence to show just how you have developed and climbed your way up in these different leadership levels, how you have personally grown as a leader through all those actions, all the things that you've done. They're all listed on the ecosystem as a portfolio of evidence, and they can be shared with whoever needs to see that, or whoever you want to show that to. So if you take a look at the different leadership levels, the types of points that you'll need to earn, it starts from 6,000 points to reach the first leadership level. And then you're working your way up to currently leadership level 6, which is at 36,000 points. In the future, those leadership levels will be increased. We'll go up to maybe leadership level 10 and so on as more and more people climb this ladder, because there's never a destination. There's never an end to this development. So we'll continuously to improve on that as well. And that's the wonderful thing about this ecosystem, is that because it's an ecosystem, it can continuously evolve as well. So if you want to have more information, if this interests you and you want to find out more, please go to the website thinklead.app, where you can join the ThinkLead ecosystem. You'll be able to find out more information on there as well, and you can start on your journey for your creating your leadership fitness. So thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate your time. Over back to you, Dave, to close off the session. Thanks so much.
Great, Randall. Thank you very much. Again, thank you to all of you for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you with us. Andy, again, thank you to you for great presentation. Really was, learned so much from it, and appreciate your knowledge and wisdom and just your presentation style. A very caring person. And thanks to everybody for being here. It's been wonderful to see you. Have a blessed holiday season. If we don't speak to you before that, our next webcast will be in January next year, in the 2023. But it's been great serving you over the last year. Thank you so much to all of you. Have a wonderful day, wonderful year ahead, and God bless you all. Bye.